Hi everyone, my name's Jess and I'm a psychologist in the Wellbeing team here at Cranbourne Secondary College. Welcome to the Child Safe presentation for 2023. Before I begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we are gathered today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Expect from the presentation today is that first I'm going to talk about normalising age-appropriate behaviours and some presentations that you might see. Then I'm going to be talking about suicidal ideation and self-harm. So these topics can be quite challenging for some people, so just be mindful of your own mental health as I'm going through this presentation and take breaks as you need to. I'm then going to talk about child safety and the processes that we have here at Cranbourne Secondary College to make sure that you're fulfilling your mandatory reporting requirements. And then I will be talking to MARAM, SIS and FIS, which are acronyms, of course, again, with the Department of Education, but essentially there's just some new reforms that have come out that you need to be aware of. So at Cranbourne Secondary College, we do discourage the use of diagnostic constructs to describe students unless there is a strong rationale to do so. So we've received a formal diagnosis or diagnoses from external practitioners. And I know that this can be challenging as well because words like anxiety have become a part of our language and our layperson speak, but instead of saying things like student A is depressed, we want to reframe that to student A is experiencing feelings of sadness or low mood. So instead of student A has anxiety or student A is anxious, we want to reframe that to student A is worried or student A is worried about XYZ. You might be sitting there thinking, what's the big deal? But what we also need to keep in mind is normal adolescent development. So some of these presentations might be typical for our young people, considering the context of what they might be going through or their developmental stage. But also sometimes young people can really identify with diagnostic constructs. And what that might result in is lots of Googling, having a look at what those terms might mean, and then now young people might really start identifying with those without actually having a formal diagnosis from a practitioner. Part of this presentation does cover suicide and self-harm, so just a content warning that this is what's coming up, and I know that these can be really difficult topics for some people, so please be mindful of the impact of this presentation on your own mental health and well-being and seek support when you need to, and you can use the EAP, which is free through this college as well. So when we say suicidal ideation, what we mean are thoughts of suicide. So this can vary significantly in intensity from fleeting thoughts, so things that kind of just come in and come out of the young person's mind, or to concrete thoughts of killing oneself, and that's including planning and intention to die, things like that. Self-harm, what we're looking at there is non-suicidal self-injury, so things like cutting, burning, hitting, scratching. This is a maladaptive coping strategy for our young people, and it's a non-verbal way of communicating feelings. So we want to move away from the stigma or the idea that self-harm is attention seeking, and instead what we want to use that as it's a non-verbal way of communicating feelings that young people might be experiencing, and what they're actually trying to do is cope with those strong feelings that they're having. So self-harm doesn't always equal suicidal ideation, and that's what a risk assessment will do, is determine the difference there. But 65% of students who do self-harm will also be suicidal at some stage. You'll notice that our young people do often joke about suicidal ideation as well. So you might have a young person say, oh, if I do poorly on this test, then I'm just going to kill myself, or something along the lines of that. However, we do really need to make sure that we're taking these jokes seriously, because sometimes it can be a way to communicate feelings. So it's often a legitimate joke, but sometimes it can actually be a way of the young person seeking some help and support as well. So what do you need to do as a staff member at Cranbourne? We need you to report the disclosure as soon as possible to a member of the SRCT team. So that is the Suicide Risk Continuum team, and this should be done by phone and not email. So I'll talk more about the SRCT next. We have 10 SRCT trained staff members across the college, and those staff members are listed there on this slide. And essentially, these staff members have done additional training to be able to do a screening risk assessment to determine whether or not the joke is more legitimate and needs a formal risk assessment to be conducted by the wellbeing team, or whether or not it was a joke and that there needs to be some education around the way the young person's communicating and some contact home to the family. When you're responding to suicidal ideation or self-harm, so we're moving away from jokes and we're coming to real disclosures from young people, or even if you've noticed some self-harm on a young person's wrist or something like that, we never promise a student that you're going to keep their disclosure confidential. So what you need to do is validate the student's reports. So for example, that sounds really difficult for you, and advise them that you have an obligation to share what they've disclosed with you to the student wellbeing team. Let us know at the wellbeing team in a timely manner. So ASAP is preferable. No emails, please. And for those of you that are coordinators in the room and year level leaders, we also don't use the referral form for this process either. What we need to do is either pick up the phone, or if you can come to the wellbeing space, do not let the student out of sight. That's really important as well. And I will just make an emphasis here on letting us know in a timely manner. This needs to happen before the end of the school day. We need to be able to meet the young person and conduct a risk assessment before they go home for the day. If we're not able to, sometimes this might result in having to call the police for a welfare check as well. Now, I know that there's been quite a bit of content in relation to suicidal ideation and self-harm, so I thought I would summarise it for you here on this slide. But essentially, your role when exposed to casual remarks or vague comments or other concerns, so things like having suicide or self-harm expressed through drawings or written work, we need you to contact a member of the SRCT team and make sure you report the disclosure as soon as possible. This should not be done via email, but via phone. If there is a clear disclosure of suicidal ideation or clear evidence of self-harm, report the disclosure as soon as possible to a member of the student wellbeing team. Again, this should be done by phone, not via email or the Compass referral. If you are unsure about whether to go to SRCT or the wellbeing team, it doesn't matter as long as you go to somebody and it's being reported as soon as possible, and then one of us will determine the appropriate avenue and be able to meet with the young person. But I guess ultimately the takeaway message there is that you do this as soon as possible. The three takeaway messages before we shift into the child safety component of this presentation is the introduction of our SRCT staff. So they're the staff members that will respond to vague comments or jokes about suicide. It's very important that you never promise a student that you'll keep their disclosure of self-harm or suicidal ideation confidential. And again, is just make sure you let us know immediately or as soon as possible. The next section of this presentation will focus on child safety and the processes that we have in place here at Cranbourne Secondary College to make sure that you're fulfilling your mandatory reporting requirements, but also to make sure that we are looking after our young people's safety as well. So I'm going to talk to you about the child safe standards, what the term reasonable grounds mean, critical information that you need to be aware of, and the 4 critical actions that we need to take as a school. So the child safe standards commenced in Victoria in January of 2016. It's important to recognise that in July of 2022, these standards were revised and our relevant policies and procedures have been updated. There are now 11 new standards that will replace the existing 7 standards and principles. And these changes have been made to support the greater national consistency, reflecting the national principles for the Child Safe organisation, which developed following the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Now, that's a whole heap of jargon, but essentially the Child Safe standards are compulsory minimum standards for all organisations that provide services to children, and all All school staff members have a moral and legal obligation, as well as a duty of care, to protect children from reasonably foreseeable harm. So it's not just staff who are classified as mandatory reporters, it's everyone employed at Cranbourne Secondary College. And the take-home message there is that you must act and we have to do something about it. In relation to reporting and child abuse, you will hear the term reasonable grounds, and essentially what this means is you need to have reasonable grounds to form a belief that a young person is being abused. We do not need evidence that it's occurring, but we need to have reasonable grounds. And that might be that the young person states that they're being abused or someone they know is being abused. You might start to notice some significant changes in their behaviour. You might observe signs or indicators of abuse, so things like unexplained injury or persistent neglect or poor care or lack of appropriate supervision. So there might be lots of different reasons for you to form reasonable grounds that a young person is being abused, and when you've done so, you need to report this immediately to the student wellbeing team. You might be the best placed or the only adult in a position to identify and respond to suspected abuse. So when identifying child abuse, it is critical to remember that the trauma associated with child abuse can significantly impact the well-being, safety, stability, and development of a young child and young person. And all concerns about the safety and well-being of a child must be acted upon as soon as possible. So what constitutes child abuse? There are lots of different categories that child abuse can fall under. I'm not going to spend the time now going through each individual one. However, if you did want to refresh your memory and your learning, I will include a link at the end of this presentation and you'll be able to go and have a look at that yourself. However, what we're looking at here is physical abuse, sexual abuse and grooming, and it is important to note that in 2014 the law in Victoria was changed to create the failure to disclose offence. This is only in relation to reports of sexual abuse and forming a reasonable belief that a young person is being sexually abused. What this means is if you fail to report this, you can be charged with a criminal offence that you did not report this disclosure, and the maximum penalties is 3 years in prison. There is also emotional abuse, neglect, family violence, and other matters that should be reported are forced marriage, age inappropriate sexualised behaviour, and student sexual offending. There are 4 critical actions that we must take as a college if we form a reasonable belief that child abuse is happening to one of our young people. First is responding to an emergency, and that's things about immediate safety. Number 2 is responding to authorities, and then 3, contacting parents, and 4, providing ongoing support. What I'm going to focus on here today is responding to authorities, because this is your main role. You'll see these protect documents posted up around the college, and these are the 4 critical actions for schools in more detail, so they highlight what we need to do under each critical action. There is a different one, so this one here is for responding to incidents, disclosures and suspicions of child abuse. And this one here is responding to student sexual offending. So you'll see those posted up around the college. So like I said, we're going to be focusing on action number 2, reporting to authorities. It's really important that we report all incidents, suspicions and disclosures of child abuse ASAP. So time is really critical here. If you believe that a child is not subject to abuse, but you still hold significant concerns for their well-being, you must still act. It's crucial to report irrespective of whether you have confirmation. So if there's any doubt, report. When you have those concerns for a young person, it is imperative that you come to the wellbeing team. What we have developed here is an incident report and an incident report checklist. And this goes through step by step of the requirements that you have to do and fulfill as a part of our child safe policies and procedures here at the college. And we have matched the document to the Protect document, so the colours are the same as well. And we'll help you work through this when you come to see us about the disclosure. So what authorities do we have to report to? If the source of abuse is within the family or community, you must report to DFFH, Child Protection. And if there is suspected child abuse and grooming, we must report this to Victoria Police and SOCIT, which is the Sexual Offences and Child Abuse Investigation Teams. Also, you need to report internally to the Student Wellbeing Clinician and or Marnie McLean, who's our Child Safe Officer, and Emergency Management. So I'll talk more about this in the next slide. It's really important before you contact or report to the authorities that you do present to either Student Wellbeing or speak with Marnie to get one of those incident response checklists, but also talk through what the disclosure is. That way we can help support you with the reports that you have to make. So that's the first step, is reporting internally. We will then determine or help you determine whether or not a report to Child Protection is required. And what will happen when you contact Child Protection is that they will undertake a risk assessment to consider potential for harm and determine a course of action. So the information on the outcomes of your report will only be shared with you if this is in the best interest of the child. So things to note, and this is really important, Child Protection will very likely pressure you into investigating your concerns further. Reporting can be really overwhelming, but remember that the Wellbeing team and the PCO team are here to support you. And do not provide Child Protection with your mobile number. If they do pressure you into investigating the concerns further, the line that you need to say is, "That's not within my role and I won't be doing that," which is really challenging when you've got an authority on the other end of the line, but it isn't your role to investigate these, your concerns. That is the role of Child Protection. Okay, so here's a bit of a flow chart of what happens when you contact DFFH or Child Protection. So initially, when you get through, you will speak with an admin team member, and all you need to say is, "I'd like to make a notification or a report about a young person at our school." You need to provide the student's name and date of birth. The admin team member will either let you know that there is already an allocated caseworker. If that is the case, we need you to ask the admin person for the caseworker's full name. What will happen is you will either then leave a message advising that you would like to make a notification with the caseworker, or you'll be able to speak with the caseworker directly about your concerns. In most cases, what happens is that there is no allocated caseworker, which means that you'll go to the intake line of Child Protection. Sometimes this can be a lengthy wait, which is up to 3 hours. If you can hold and wait on hold, then that is preferable. Otherwise, there is an option for a callback. And again, do not leave your mobile number, leave the college's number. However, it is preferable if you can wait on hold, which is why it comes back to as soon as you find out about this disclosure, report it ASAP so we can get this process happening, because sometimes, the wait can be up to 3 hours long. In cases where there has been sexual abuse involved, we do need to contact SOCIT. So what happens is you'll initially get through to another admin team member, and you need to say that I would like to make a report of an incident of child abuse. They'll pop you through directly to a police officer. There is usually no wait time with SOCIT, which is great. You need to provide the student name and the details of your concerns. The police officer will take your report and either provide you advice or consultation, or they'll take your report and request to attend the college to interview a student. If that is the outcome, you need to let Student Wellbeing know ASAP so we can prepare the school for that visit. After you've made the reports to the authorities, we need to contact Emergency Management, which is the Department of Education's Security Services unit. So what happens is when you call Emergency Management, you go straight through to a Security Services officer, and you just need to let them know that you would like to report an incident. You'll be asked to report on the nature of the incident and the actions that have been followed. So what happened, what was disclosed, who have you contacted, what recommendations were made. After you've made the report on what happened and the authorities you've contacted, you then need to provide the student's name, date of birth, age, year level, whether or not they're out of home care, PSD, or any other significant barriers or vulnerabilities. What happens after that is that you send an emergency management email, which is a summary of the disclosure, actions, and recommendations. In the paperwork that I spoke about earlier, there is a list of all the people that need to be included in that emergency management email, which is all the PCO team, all of the student wellbeing team, the year level leader, and if the young person is a PSD funded student, then also the PSD coordinator as well. Again, I know that this probably feels really overwhelming, but we can sit with you and work through all of these phone calls and this email and the documentation together if needed. Action number 3 is contacting parents and carers. In most cases, it is not going to be your role to contact the parents or carers. So that will either be a PCO member or a member of the student wellbeing team. So initially what we will do is consult with DFFH or Child Protection and or Victoria Police or Socket to determine what information, if any, can be shared with parents and carers. So this part is really important, that it's not your role to contact the parents or carers of the young person. Action number 4 is providing ongoing support. So the school as a system must provide support for students impacted by abuse. You can play a pertinent role in supporting students who have been or are subjected to abuse. However, be mindful of boundaries and where possible, refer to the student wellbeing team to support with managing emotions and referrals to outside agencies where necessary. Regarding boundaries, a few recommendations for your own wellbeing. Do not provide your personal mobile number to students, and do not agree to keep information a student discloses to you confidential. It puts you in a really challenging position if you promise that you'll keep things private and then they tell you something that you need to report or disclose, and then that can also develop or damage that relationship that you've already built with the young person. So just reminding them that you can't actually keep what they're telling you private. Okay, so some other important considerations. I did just touch on this before, but when a disclosure of abuse is made and or you are concerned that a child has been abused or is at risk of being abused, you should inform the student that their confidentiality cannot be maintained. This should be done in language appropriate for the student's age and stage of development. So for example, to a younger student or a more emotionally immature student, you might say something like, I'm not going to be able to keep your story a secret. I really have to tell someone who's going to be able to help you. For a more mature student or an older student, you might say something like, the information you have given me has made me really concerned for your well-being, and I need to tell you that it's my responsibility to report this information to help you get some support. So the takeaway messages for child safety and reporting is, if in doubt, report. Don't promise a student that the disclosure will remain confidential. Boundaries, do not provide your mobile number to Child Protection or Socket. Please only provide the college number. And Child Protection may pressure the reporter to investigate, and it is not your role of the reporter to do so, so just make sure that you let Child Protection know that if they do ask you to investigate further. Now, I know that there's a lot of information there, but please remember that the PCO team and the student wellbeing team are here to support you with any matters relating to Child Safe. Just let us know as soon as possible so we can help support you through that process. So the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to speak to you about MARAM, SIS and FIS. So in April of 2021, Cranbourne Secondary, along with a number of other entities, became an ISE, which is an information sharing entity. As a result of a number of reforms and coroner's inquiries, the Victorian Government has implemented the SIS and FIS scheme, so the Child Information Sharing Scheme and the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme, and the MARAM framework, which is a multi-agency risk assessment and management framework. I'll speak about each of these, but essentially these reforms aim to foster collaborative practice to prioritise the wellbeing and safety of children over the privacy of adults. So the Child Information Sharing Scheme promotes the wellbeing and safety of the students that we work with. So this scheme enables all information sharing entities to share confidential information about any person to promote the wellbeing and or safety of a child or group of children. Consent is not required from any person when sharing under SIS. However, there are strict threshold requirements that must be met in order for an ISE to share this information. So the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme, FIS, and the MARAM framework aim to identify and respond to family violence. The FIS scheme enables the sharing of relevant information between authorised organisations to assess or manage the risk of family violence. So a risk-sharing entity might be someone like Child Protection, and they can request information from us as a school to help manage the risk and assess the risk of family violence. MARAM aims to build a shared understanding and consistent response to family violence across Victoria's service system. Again, there are strict threshold requirements that must be met in order for an ISE to share information. So what does this mean for you at Cranbourne Secondary College? These reforms aim to foster collaborative practice and to prioritise the wellbeing and safety of children. They work in conjunction with our existing child safe standards and responsible relationships. So your role is you may receive contact from another information sharing entity or risk assessment entity. So it might be someone from another school, or it might be Child Protection, or it might be a hospital, requesting information about a student under these schemes. When a request like this comes through, please take the relevant details of the organisation, the student's details, and send an email to Mel Bannister, who's the team leader of the wellbeing team, who will coordinate the response. So it is not your role to respond to the request. Just take the details and the information and provide it to Mel Bannister in the student wellbeing team. So our takeaway messages for this section is just be aware of the acronyms at this stage. You do not need to know how these schemes work operationally. If you receive any queries regarding MARAM, SIS or FIS, please take down the relevant information and send an email to Mel Bannister, who's the wellbeing team leader. The relevant policies and procedures at our college will be updated over time. Please remember that you are able to access EAP for support. There's some really challenging things that we work with and we are exposed to when working within schools. So just make sure that you are being mindful of your own wellbeing and reaching out for support when needed. If there are any additional questions, I will upload a Q&A form, or just pop down to wellbeing and come and have a chat with one of us, and we can help support you through whatever questions you may have. And there is additional learning as well, which is obviously what you've found because you're here listening to this recording. But if you also wanted to go to the education website, which I've included a link there, there's all the information you need about child protection and reporting, and all of the additional information about the different categories of abuse that I spoke about earlier. Like I said, if you do need any support or you have any questions, please don't hesitate to come and see us at Wellbeing or speak to a member of the PCO team. So yeah, thank you for attending the presentation today.